Always true.
As the United States and Israel continue their war in Iran, the focus has been on missiles, targets, and the question of who is winning. But what if that's the wrong question? Because in many modern conflicts, victory is no longer the only or even the main objective. Wars today don't just destroy, they also produce. They reshape power, economies, and create systems that can outlive the battlefield itself. From sanctions and arms industries to smuggling networks and shadow economies, conflict can become functional. For some, it consolidates political control. For others, it opens new streams of profit. And for many, it creates a constant state of threat that justifies its own continuation. Wars are not always designed to end. They evolve, adapt, and sometimes they sustain the very actors fighting them. In the Middle East, that system is becoming increasingly fragmented as states are no longer the only players. Armed groups, informal networks, and regional actors play roles that shape conflicts in ways the global powers can't fully control. The consequences stretch far beyond the battlefield. From energy markets to inflation, from superpowers to developing economies, the costs of conflict are global. But so too are its incentives. So if war can become economically and politically useful, what does that mean for peace? To make sense of it all and to understand why some wars don't end, we turn to a leading voice in the political economy of conflict. Professor of Conflict Studies at the London School of Economics, David Keane, talks to Al Jazeera. David Keane, welcome to Talk to Al Jazeera. You are a pioneer in the political economy of conflict, so a field that shifts the focus away from who may be winning the war militarily to who is essentially benefiting politically from all of this. Can you start by explaining to us what that means? Set out your stall for us, if you may.
Well, I think if we think about the aims in a war, we often think the aim in a war is to win. And clearly, that is an important aim in a war. But there are also many others, and one of them, I think, is making money. Another one is a sort of a set of political functions or benefits that may include things like suppressing dissent, under the cover of war, or divide and rule, or, painting dissent as disloyalty, or even turning your enemy into the image that you've put about in your propaganda, making the enemy resemble your propaganda. So those are two other aims. Then there's sort of psychological aims, and I think reversing shame and humiliation is often a big one. And a fourth one, I would say, is the simple one of trying to stay alive. Now, if the aim is winning, then what you need to do is weaken or eliminate your enemy. But with a lot of the other aims, sometimes the enemy can be surprisingly useful. So we get this phenomenon of useful enemies, which I think is a real phenomenon. And the problem there is that people acquire, as it were, like quite a wide range of vested interests, acquire an interest sometimes in actually maintaining the enemy or taking actions that are predictably counterproductive in terms of the reproduction of the enemy. So making people angry, attacking civilians, winning, as it were, new recruits for the entity. It might be a rebel group or a terrorist group or a nation that they claim to be trying to oppose or weaken. So there's a question mark I'm trying to raise in a way about the aims in a war and whether the enemy is somebody that you want to eliminate or somebody that you might be interested at some level in continuing the existence of.
David, at this juncture in the Israeli-US war on Iran, where despite claims by both sides of a degree of military success, it's almost impossible to say who the actual winners are. But given your focus on how you frame world conflict, I wonder whether it's possible to ask who benefits from this tension the most without potentially the need for an absolute victory.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting and complicated question. I mean, one of the things that we can observe, and this is, I think, very common in wars, is that even when there hasn't really been a convincing victory by any party, a number of different parties find reasons to claim that they have registered a success in the war. And Trump, I think, awarded himself 15 out of 10 for his success in the war. Israel obviously would claim some security benefits. Iran can point to its ability to retaliate and so on. But I think if you can claim success, then that is kind of a political benefit in itself. Beyond that, I think that, the functions of war as a distraction and the functions of war as something that can quieten internal dissent and allow you to paint opponents as disloyal is something that is really quite important, in the United States, in Iran, and in Israel. And I think there are elements, for example, of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, that have an interest in the continuation of sanctions, that have an interest in the continuation of international tension, pointing to common enemies, labeling dissenters as disloyal, and so on. So these things come into play, and I think in terms of Israeli politics, there's been a lot of trying to portray opposition as disloyal. There's been attempts to postpone accountability for corruption. There is, in a way, I think, a serial use of war, including in Gaza, which was really a genocide in my book, to distract from a process of accountability at home. And I think Trump himself is very concerned with distracting people at the moment.
Yeah, let me just jump in there and break down what you've just said, because you've made it sound as if the benefits of conflict for some countries far outweigh the desire for any kind of lasting resolution as a means of controlling opposition voices or any kind of opposition within those given countries. So war is the ultimate distraction, as you say.
Well, it is the ultimate distraction. It doesn't mean that some of the threats are not real, because 9/11 was very real. Iran has made many threats against Israel, and so on. We have the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel and so on. So these things are not necessarily invented, and often they're all too real and all too horrible. But nevertheless, if we look at the pattern of responding to some of these events, I think it does predictably create new enemies. It does predictably enrage people. And so we have to look beyond the declared aim of weakening the enemy at the other possible functions, psychological, economic, and political, of taking these, what in my book are predictably counterproductive actions that are going to exacerbate conflict, that are going to perpetuate the war on terror, probably entrenching the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, though of course we don't know. We have to keep an open mind about these things.
Just picking up, David, on something else you said, because I'd like to know how this narrative of, I guess, a kind of continuous existential threat allows countries to bypass demands within their own country. So let's say demands for economic reform, human rights, desire for an increase in public spending. Because in the first 100 hours of this conflict, the US burned through $800 million per day. I mean, that's significantly higher than the opening of the Iraq or Afghanistan wars. I mean, that's money that could have been spent on housing, on education, on healthcare in the United States, but it's been funneled into the war coffers.
Yeah, and I actually thought, during Trump's first administration, the one sort of good thing about him was that he seemed to be relatively reluctant to launch international wars, and he had a whole critique of the neoconservatives and the way that, a lot of the elements of the war on terror, the waste of money, the waste of lives, and so on, that involved. And that to me was the one really relatively convincing part of his campaign. But he now seems to have radically departed from that. And of course, Trump loves freedom. I mean, he loves his own freedom and the ability to change his mind, to set the agenda. And he has taken the United States in a radically different direction. I also think Israel has kind of adopted some increasingly drastic remedies to trying to solve the problem of its own security, as we saw in Gaza. So these things can kind of radicalize. And actually, I think if you create enough enemies, or you contribute to the existence of enough enemies, that in itself can encourage some very drastic solutions because of the fear of retaliation.
Yeah, talking about drastic solutions, this is what the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said when he was questioned about the eye-watering costs of waging this war. He said, quote, "It costs a lot of money to kill bad guys. It costs a lot of money to kill bad guys." I mean, ironically, the Iranians have shown that they can fight an asymmetric war at a fraction of the cost. That must be a rude awakening for the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think the Iranian regime has been quite clever in promoting influence in places like Syria, in Lebanon, and so on, at a fairly low cost, and a lot of it is encouraging militia strategies and recruiting people who are often quite impoverished at relatively low cost, providing training, which is relatively cheap, and so on. As far as the United States government is concerned, I think this division of people into good guys and bad guys is incredibly simplistic. And it goes back at least as far as the Vietnam War, And the idea there, as you know, was if we can just kill enough bad guys, kill enough Viet Cong, then this is going to solve the problem of Vietnam. But, we know that the mass bombing of Vietnam created a huge number of additional recruits to the Viet Cong. So those tactics don't work. And you have to think more creatively about how to isolate the so-called bad guys. And that usually means tackling the corruption and the violence that has created a rebellion or a terrorist movement in the first place.
On that point, David, let's focus on Iran, if we may, because there are those clearly, as you've suggested, who benefit, I guess, from a continuation of the current system in Iran. And when I say current system, I also mean potentially benefiting from a continuation of Western sanctions also. I'm thinking about those who may have benefited from state monopolies, those who are controlling smuggling or the black markets, for instance.
Well, yeah, this is something that we see many times in conflicts. We saw it in Syria. We've seen it in former Yugoslavia as well, and Iraq as well. When you get sanctions, you tend to get a big price difference between the country that's being sanctioned and the surrounding area. And if you can actually successfully breach international sanctions, which clearly the Revolutionary Guards have done in the case of Iran, the profits are often very considerable, and often you get a monopoly, as they have had, basically, as I understand it, on the smuggling that is breaching the sanctions. So I do think sanctions are very problematic in that way, and it partly relates to people's ability to get around them. And of course, the sort of the diverse nature of superpowers at the moment, with Russia and China and so on. You have plenty of options. And you can go outside the dollar-based system. This is part of the reason why so many people want gold at the moment.
So
And
David,
try to
let me
evade
try
some of
and
these sanctions.
let me try and distill this then, because what I'm hearing is that you're saying that sometimes when the cost of war is cheaper for a nation or more beneficial for a nation than the price of peace, then it works in their interest to, in some ways, sustain frictions, to maintain hostilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the strongest example of that, or one of the strongest, is basically the incredible level of military spending within the United States that survived the end of the Cold War. You know, you would have thought that was an opportunity to dismantle the military-industrial structures, but spending stayed pretty much at the levels of the height of the Cold War. So why was that opportunity not taken? Well, clearly there were a number of threats around the world which the government pointed to and the defense industry pointed to, and terrorism was foremost among them for a while, and then Russia kind of came up the agenda. But that was an opportunity that was spurned. And of course, these things have consequences, because if you build up your own arms, you're encouraging the other guy to build up their arms, and then you can point to his arms buildup as justification for your own. And this is what happened during the Cold War. So we have these kind of self-sustaining systems that are built on the mass manufacture of things that can kill people. It is extremely profitable. And there are a lot of predictably counterproductive tactics that are being adopted, which serve those systems, and I think very rarely work. Of course, you can declare victory. You know, remember the mission accomplished in 2003 that George W. Bush declared. But these victories very rarely materialize, because a war economy will often deepen, it will complicate.
Let me pick you up upon that point of mission accomplished, because you know we're talking about the apparent end of the war on terror, the decades of conflict that came after 9/11. I mean, we did, of course, see the destruction of al-Qaeda. We saw the killing of Osama bin Laden. We saw the US pull out of Afghanistan. But in your mind, is what we are seeing now in the Middle East some way of a continuation of that war on terror, or is it something else? Is it something new?
Well, I think it is partly a continuation of it, yeah. We saw, as you say, the defeat of al-Qaeda, but then, of course, we had al-Qaeda in Iraq, which kind of grew out of it. There was a claim of victory against al-Qaeda in Iraq, but then we had ISIS, which grew to a large extent out of al-Qaeda in Iraq. So you have this sort of serial declaration of victories, and then people can relax for a little bit, but then something else happens. And a lot of times these threats are feeding into each other. There's a continuity between these organizations. I think, you know, the destruction of Gaza, you know, that is in a way a very distinct problem, but it was an action that was presented by Israel within the framework of a war on terror. In Sri Lanka, where I was in 2009, you know, the government wreaked horrible destruction on the Tamil population in the name of an international war on terror. And it was actually difficult for Britain or the United States to criticize that. You know, when they themselves were detaining people indefinitely, they themselves had the language of the war on terror, and we need to be ruthless. We need to suspend liberty to a certain extent in the interest of security.
Specifically on the language used around the war on terror, I guess a very seismic symbolic shift at least came with the rebranding of the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of War, the Defense Department to the War Department, because, I mean, that signalled almost a kind of move away from more of a reactive war on terror to a US administration that sought to project power, to pursue peace through strength, I think is the words used by Pete Hegseth. So do you see that as a rebranding of what's gone before? Or is that really a defining departure from what we've seen in the past?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it is partly a rebranding, but it's partly an indication that violence and the assertion of America's right, in particular, to do what it's like, to do what it likes, has become sort of incredibly shameless under Trump. And Trump is somebody really who has systematically rejected shame and indeed made a lot of political capital, in my opinion, out of offering people a kind of vicarious shamelessness through his abuses and through his spectacular demonstrations of freedom, as I say, freedom for himself. So I think, there are some significant differences. For example, George W. Bush and Tony Blair, they did make some efforts to try to create some sense of international legitimacy for what they wanted to do in Iraq and to try and get the UN on board to a certain extent. We're not seeing that now with Trump and Netanyahu. We're just seeing a kind of go-it-alone spirit, which I think is incredibly dangerous and incredibly destructive. So I do think there's a shamelessness about what's going on. And that thing you mentioned about relabeling as a Department of War, Trump would say, well, this is honesty. He projects this image of honesty. I'm not a hypocrite. The liberals are hypocrites. I tell you the truth as it is. And he's made some considerable political capital out of that, in my opinion. But it's also a very frightening turn.
David, talking about political capital, we've talked about the big powers. I'd like to talk about the small powers, if I may, because I wonder if the rise of non-state actors, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, whether they fit into this frame as well. Because I want to know if they are motivated by the same impulses that perhaps Iran or the United States may be for their own ends. I mean, how does your approach to this work when war is being waged by smaller paramilitary networks? OK, some see Hezbollah as being almost a kind of mini franchise of Iran in the same way that you would view the branch of a bank internationally. But is that a wrong way of looking at this?
Well, I think a lot of these non-state actors, they do very often have state backers, and we've seen it with Hezbollah, we've seen it with the Rapid Support Forces and the UAE in Sudan. So we can't sort of regard them simply as non-state actors. I think that, in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon, there has been quite a strong effort from the Lebanese government to weaken Hezbollah. And that's something that can potentially, I think, bear a lot of fruit. And then when Israel comes in and starts bombing Lebanon and displacing, as I understand it, 1 million people, this can easily set things back. So the states tend to sort of weigh in on these struggles, these local struggles, often in extremely counterproductive ways. I think Sudan, is an interesting case of a government that, going back to the 1980s, tried to mobilize militias, mobilize its own militias for the purposes of counterinsurgency. But then the government, in a way, lost control of the violence because the militias were economically motivated to a large extent. They spread rebellion to new areas. And on the whole, they refused to disband after particular military campaigns. And they became, as it were, a political factor in their own right. And we know that the RSF, is a successor to the Janjaweed militias that created the Darfur genocide. And it's been a huge factor in Sudan politics ever since, basically extorting the government, using gold in particular to build up its strength, and eventually turning against the army with the result of this horrific civil war that we have at the moment. So militias don't always obey what their puppet masters tell them to do, and that can be very destructive in itself.
David, can a conflict like the Iran-Israel rivalry ever truly end, taking in everything you've discussed, or does that system simply evolve into new forms of hybrid warfare, all to protect essentially underlying profit margins and existing power structures?
Well, I think conflicts can come to an end. I think a lot of people thought that the Cold War would never end because partly of the vested interests involved, but it did actually surprise us by ending. Of course, people who were making the argument that it will never end will now point to various aspects of a revival of the Cold War, in terms of Russia and even China and so on. So I do think sometimes that violence is a little bit like energy, in the sense that it can change from one form to another, but it very rarely disappears entirely. In practice, I think, one of the things you can do is to make peace more profitable and more attractive for various warring parties than war itself. You can offer them a stake in a political settlement, in a peace process. You can buy them off, if you like. One of the problems with that, of course, is that you tend to entrench corruption and indeed violence within the peace settlement that you're actually creating or offering.
David, in a fragmented global economy, I mean, how does the political conflict of those big powers, the political conflict that we are seeing play out in the Middle East, I mean, how does that affect the global South? How does that affect nations that are watching from the sidelines while simultaneously protecting the big powers in Washington, D.C., in Beijing or Moscow, for instance?
I think there are a lot of economic impacts as well. For example, the World Food Programme now is talking about perhaps 45 million people facing severe food shortages and starvation as a result of the war that's currently going on with Iran and Israel and the United States. So, we know that oil prices are going up. We know that fertilizer prices have been drastically affected. This affects food production and it affects people's food security. And I think, if we go back in history just a little bit to, for example, 2011, you had a huge increase in global food prices for various reasons. And that fed rather directly into famine in places like Yemen and Somalia. And it also fed into the so-called Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria, for example. So these kind of knock-on effects, they're not always predictable, but I think you can predict that many of them are going to be extremely bad, and the people that are going to suffer are going to be, very far from Washington or Jerusalem.
David Keane, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you.